here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer Nancy Barile, who has brought a book out titled I'm Not Holding Your Coat, My Bruises-and-All, Memoir of Punk Rock Rebellion. It's out on paperback, came out last month, May 2021, and tells the story of, well, it says here, a Catholic schoolgirl who went on to be part of the early 1980s East Coast hardcore scene and shows. She's going to explain all that in the interview, so I'm not going to bore you. But anyway, Nancy Barile, the book is titled I'm Not Holding Your Coat. And after several minutes of casual chat, which we edited out, well, I did, we got down to the reason behind putting this book out. And this is Nancy, who's going to explain it all. Anyway, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I was out of it for quite some time, and I was working as a teacher. I mean, I still loved music. I still listened to music, but I always referred back to my time in punk rock and hardcore. You know, I drew on that so much in my professional life as a teacher. And one day, Reverend Hank Pierce, who's kind of an icon around here, he asked me to write an article on how punk rock affected my teaching. And so I did, and then I submitted it to a magazine called Education Week up here that's really, you know, nationwide, United States. And it kind of went viral. And then I did an ed talk on how punk rock made me a better teacher. And, you know, when I really sat down and thought about it, it wasn't years of schooling or endless professional development or anything like that, that I think helped me as a teacher. It was what I learned through punk rock, everything from connecting to alienated and marginalized teens to the whole do-it-yourself work ethic and raising funds for resources for my school, and, you know, teaching my students the power of the written word and the power of oral communication, and of course standing up to authority and fighting back when you know, needed to. All that came from punk rock. So,
Yes.
you know, I was like, and then I started talking about it in Facebook groups. You know, when an anniversary of a show came, I would tell a story, and people were like, "Oh, this is such a great story. You should write a book." You know, and so I did.
I know. It's quite incredible, you know, and it's just funny because both funny and funny just because of coincidence. Just the amount of people who, you know, like, you know, I did an interview with a guy called Keith West, who was in a band called The In Crowd, and then Tomorrow from the 60s, and sort of spent his life in music, and Dana Gillespie, who's, you know, worked with David Bowie and Mick Ronson, and then she's written a book. So it's kind of great that people, this kind of oral history that has come out, and obviously the 80s is kind of my decade, so it's a bit more like, oh yes, this is great, and it suddenly becomes much more kind of interesting. Though I love the 60s and I love the 70s, it's kind of then the post punk period that is kind of fascinating, and that whole the indie world that started. So with your own, you know, with a bit about your own background, how did, you know, because I'm basically in my mid-50s, I was born 64, when and it was kind of the early glam period, when did music suddenly become something in your life that you were suddenly engaged with, thinking, wow, that's something? Because we had Top of the Pops in this country.
Yes, and we had Ed Sullivan and bands and shows like that. So, you know, growing up, I can remember getting a record player when I was 5 years old, and, you know, listening to records all the time, the Beatles, Chubby Checker, you know, and there was always that little bit of a darker side of music that, you know, I really loved. Like when I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, you know, I screamed along with everyone else. But when I saw the Rolling Stones, there was something a little bit different about them, you know, and the Kinks and bands like that, you know, and different than, say, the Dave Clark Five, you know. And so I started to kind of gravitate towards, you know, that kind of a little edgier stuff. And then I graduated class of 77 high school. So the glam era was huge to me. David Bowie, T-Rex, you know, Mick Ronson solo stuff. That all was like, you know, Roxy Music, Sparks. that was all so important to me as a kid growing up. That was, just fabulous. And then I saw Iggy Pop because the main reason I saw him, I did buy The Idiot, and I really thought that record was unique and really cool. But David Bowie was touring with Iggy as his keyboardist, and so I had a chance for front row seats, so I'm like, I'm gonna go. And then once I saw Iggy, then it was the Ramones, then the Clash, and then just, boom, it just really, really took off. And
My God, you were there at the right place at the right time. I'm sure every teenager has their moment. So we just sound like, it's that period, isn't it? But you think, wow, that was to see David Bowie, sitting at the side of the stage playing keys.
Oh, it was amazing. It was just amazing. And I had seen David Bowie in concert. My sister had seen the David Live, the one that came out of the David Live album, but I was too young for that, but I saw Station to Station tour and Heroes tour, and I just loved Bowie. Bowie got me through high school. Couldn't have made it without him.
Well, it's interesting because my first single was Space Oddity, and first album was Changes, and then because it was my first love, he stayed with me. I didn't realize how lucky this was for the rest of his life, and throughout my life, it was like this kind of strange kind of experience I had with Bowie, which it could have been Gary Glitter. It was that close, but luckily it was David Bowie.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Yeah, I mean, Bowie just opened me up to not only different kinds of music scenes, because he was always experimenting with new things, and so that brought me into that. And but his whole worldview was just so different than the suburban Catholic school upbringing that I had. Bowie opened a lot of doors and opened my eyes to a lot of things, and I'll always be grateful for that.
Yes, he only had to say an author or a painter or an artist or a film, and we had to go and watch it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I can remember when he did. There was a dance troupe called, I don't know if you remember this,
La La.
Human Steps, right? And I was like, oh my God, now I got to get everything, see these guys that, so just continually expanding my brain for everything. If Bowie said it, then I wanted
yes.
to
Lindsay
know more
Kemp,
about
Mime,
it.
we had to sort of engage with that,
Exactly.
the photographic work of Mick Rock. So then how did you then cope? Because obviously, okay, you're in America rather than the UK at that stage, but, navigating the late teens and the early 20s is quite tricky, and sometimes one does it well and sometimes you can see sometimes it doesn't. So how did you manage not to get too sucked into that period? Because I know from speaking to a lot of people from especially America in the late 70s, and I suppose it was New York, there was a lot of heroin, a lot of drugs, a lot of people getting completely wasted, as we sort of realized that most of the New York Dolls, and that whole scene got absolutely hammered. Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan. So how, being able to be a little bit cute and know what to do and what not to do is quite interesting. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, so I mean, I never really liked drugs, growing up, even though I grew up in the 70s. I would, we would drink beer or vodka or whatever, and have fun at shows like that. But drugs were never my thing. So as I started managing a band in Philadelphia called Sadistic Exploits and going up to New York, and then meeting bands like, Black Flag and Minor Threat. And then I met my husband, who really was behind the whole straight edge movement. He took, the seeds that Ian had planted and kind of just ran with it. And so when I moved to Boston, it wasn't a requirement that I be straight edge, but I was kind of like, well, I'll give this a shot. And I really liked not drinking or, waking up the next day hungover and
Yes.
remembering what I did and, not doing anything too embarrassing, so that really, I think, came at a really good time for me, the whole straight edge movement.
Yes. And are you able just to explain a bit about what the straight edge movement is?
Okay, so it's no drinking, no drugs. That's what it was when I embraced it. It went on to be like, veganism, and it has all these, people have different tenets that they follow, but for us, it was not smoking cigarettes, not drinking, not doing drugs. And so I started, my husband was a big guy, and he started bringing me to like a weightlifting gym. And back then women did not lift weights, so it was really cool. I was that was sort of out of my comfort zone to start lifting weights and doing stuff, but I like lost weight and I got in really good shape, and it's like, this is great. Like I really kind of liked the physical side and what it did for my brain and my body, and made me just feel really clear about what I wanted to do. And then that's when I went back to school and got my teaching degree, and it just, I don't know, it added clarity to my life at a time where I think I kind of needed it.
Yes, absolutely. And sort of getting into band management, that's kind of quite an interesting experience, because obviously you don't sort of get too many kind of apprenticeship. Well, you do get an apprenticeship, I suppose, but it's a bit hit and miss. How did you sort of navigate that period?
I mean, at that time I was dating a guy who was a singer in a band, and I knew all the guys in the band, and so like I was just hoping that they would ask me to manage the band, because I wanted to be a contributor. I couldn't sing, I couldn't play an instrument, but I wanted to contribute to the scene. And so I started working as their manager, and that was really cool, because we did some of the first all ages shows in Philadelphia, which were really successful and really fun. And again, we learned that do it yourself work ethic, where you wanted to make something happen, you did it yourself, and you learned a lot along the way, and so that was super empowering to me, as a woman who grew up in a patriarchal household, in a patriarchal city, to just kind of be like, well, we're going to do shows, and 500 people are going to come, and
Yes, well, absolutely. I think that
pretty
that sort of that DIY ethos for a lot
yeah,
of people, it was just that sort of first experience of sort of, I suppose it's taking the baton, isn't it, really? Which is different than not taking the baton, taking that responsibility, putting on something, realizing how much work goes into just what looks like
exactly.
such a simple thing, which I've realized in life, that, you're the person who's booked the venue, you've sort of put your whole reputation almost on the line. And it's both exciting and totally scary, because you realize just
Absolutely.
what you need to do and what sort of person you need to become to deal with all the kind of the hassle, because no one ever thanks you at the end if it goes well. They just sort of
Yeah.
pick up on some really minor thing that didn't quite go to right, but they're never the people who actually organized anything themselves in life. They're just the ones who have just been. I remember a headmaster at school at one of those, I don't know, speech day things, prize givings. He said, "Don't be a spectator in the game of life." It was always kind of one of those profound moments, really, because that's so true. And I think that punk and indie world did allow people to, yes, take that chance to either be in a band, or start putting on club nights, which is, again, it feels like a scary thing to do, but then it is kind of worth it, because it's a sort of character building experience. So then, as the 80s progressed, what was your sort of, how did that work for you?
So after I moved to Boston, I helped manage my husband's band, SSD Control, for a while. And, we, went to California for shows, which was really fun, because the California scene was just booming. It was huge, and so that was really great. Did some shows in the Boston area. And then by 1985, we were out of it, the scene had started to devolve a little bit. Some of the bands that I loved broke up. And I was just kind of aged out of it maybe a little bit, and that's when my husband went back to school to get a mechanical engineering degree. I went back to school to get my teaching degree. We sold all my husband's equipment and bought a stand-up Kawasaki 550 jet ski, which was like kind of like the complete opposite of being in smoky, dark clubs. We were now on, outside in the sun, on lakes and the ocean, learning how to do this kind of stand-up jet ski that was really hard at the time. You had to pay your dues. So, then I was out of the scene. I'd still go to shows and see bands that I really liked, and if there were new bands that came around, but that was really kind of it for me. I never really did shows or anything after that. When Fugazi came through town, like those guys stayed at my house, and we took them around and stuff. But that was kind of it, but those formative years were really powerful, from
Well, it's like an
growing
intense
up.
relation, yeah, the intense degree course. Because actually doing this show for years, I realised there's quite an interesting narrative. I've got it down. Most bands have got 5 years. They get together, they have that honeymoon period. They don't know where they're going. They don't know if it's going to happen. For most, it doesn't. They don't go off the takeoff really, but then sometimes it happens. And in this country, we had various gatekeepers. We had a DJ called John Peel, who had this kind of show on BBC Radio 1 in the evenings, who would always play the latest, quirkiest kind of left field type of music. And then we had the 3 music papers, the weeklies, NME, Melody Maker, Sounds. So they were always desperate sort of for features. And then each city and every town would have these, a club night, an indie night, mostly on a Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, when there isn't, they're the only people who are going to go to those shows. So in a way, the band kind of then gets that kind of bit of exposure in the paper. They might get a play on John Peel show. They might get a few dates around the country. That kind of gives you that kind of, okay, let's do we've done a single, let's do the album. This is all going well. Mm-hmm. And that's good, thumbs up. And then it's this sort of tricky second album, as you kind of imagine. And if any British band ever tours America, they often, you would come back and say, and then we broke up, because it always seems to destroy British bands quite easily, really. I think no one realizes the enormity and the pressure, and just come back completely gaga, dribbling and not knowing what day of the week it is. So it's kind of interesting. You had a sort of an intense experience as well, that then means that you sort of dust yourself down and wonder what is happening next.
Right. That's pretty much it. It was very intense and crazy and fun when it was happening, but then it was over.
So when did you, because you were just saying at the start, putting this book together, you'd written some pieces. Then did you have a moment where you went, right, I'm gonna now put this into some coherent narrative and sort of do a project and finish it one day?
Right. The first part, I was originally writing a book called, How Punk Rock Made Me a Better Teacher, and it was about both punk rock and teaching. And almost immediately I got an agent in New York City, and, I thought, oh, this is going to be great. But what happened was publishers either liked the punk rock story or they liked the teacher story. They didn't like both. And so that's when I pulled off the punk rock part, because it was, teaching was still going on. This punk rock was finite, and I could break it down and I could write about it, So I wrote that, and I was lucky enough to, through a wild series of events, find Ian from Bazillion Points, who was interested in publishing it, and, worked with him, and he was just phenomenal. And I just couldn't be happier to be part of the Bazillion Points family. And it seemed like it was taking forever, but then once it was out, it was just, so fast. And, I kind of thought like, my family would buy it, and my friends, and, a couple of niche people. I didn't think, it would take off to the extent that, we shipped over 2,000 books the first week, like nobody's more shocked at that than me, like, because I'm really like a nobody, right? Like I'm just a kid who was in a scene, who happened to, be in the right place at the right time for some really cool shows and some really wild, insane experiences, like having riots and bombs thrown at me and stuff. So, and I'm an English teacher, so, I can sort of write better probably than the average bear. And storytelling was super valued in my family. If you came home and said you had a story to tell, like everybody was listening, So,
right.
that was a craft that you honed really well. Like in our yearbooks over here, I don't know if you guys have yearbooks for high school. They give teacher superlatives, you know, teacher most likely to do this, or, you know, whatever. And I always got best storyteller. You know, my students would say to me, "Tell us a story, Miss Barile." You know? So that, you know, that was really important to me, to be able to tell a good story. And so that's I think that's, you know, why the book, I think it kind of, a lot of people that were there kind of contributed in similar ways that I did. You know, they weren't in bands, but they wrote for fanzines, or they weren't in bands, but they did a show, or they weren't in a band, but, you know, they roadied for a band, you know, like, and so I sort of speak to the contributors, you know, as
Yes.
opposed to the, you know, the people that were on stage. I wish I had musical talent, but alas, I do not.
No, absolutely. And also, it must feel like a nice way to, I mean, archiving stuff is kind of quite one of those things you don't really think about when you're younger, but then as you get older, you think, actually, it's really nice to have this nicely put, because it is such a chapter in your life, and now it's become a book, obviously, and being able to tell the story, and the photographs, which are also quite fantastic in this publication as well.
Yeah, I mean,
It,
it was an enormous responsibility, is what I felt, you know, like I felt, especially to all my friends in Philly, that I wanted to do justice to what we experienced, you know, and so, you know, there are a lot of documentarians in Philadelphia. My friend Shava, Chuck, Frank, Lisa. You know, I would always turn to them and be like, okay, now, did I get this right? You know, like, because I felt like I did not, you know, when I first started talking about stuff, before I really sat down and researched it, I often had things wrong, you know, because memory is fallible, you know. And that's one reason I really liked my publisher, because my publisher would say, well, you know, you're talking about this record in July, but it didn't come out until August, you know. So, you know, I wanted to be as accurate as
yes.
possible. And that was not a responsibility that I took lightly. You know, I tried to do the best that I could in making it as accurate as possible. Of course, it's my perspective and my experience, and people, you know, people have to know that. So.
Yes, absolutely. And would your younger self be completely amazed of seeing how you've turned out, and the fact that you've managed to get a book from it?
Yes, I think my younger self would be so pumped, because even when I was a little kid in Catholic school, I used to, like, you know, try to write books and stuff, you know. I write like 3 chapters and then, you know, throw it in a drawer. So it was always a goal that I had, you know, and I just recently I saw something on Twitter where somebody said, you know, when as a writer should you give up? You know, when should you give up? And everybody was putting their, you know, their take on it. And I said, listen, you know, I'm 61 years old and I just published my first book and it sold out its first printing in a week. Like, do not give up. You know? Hang in there, because, you know, there's I don't know. I think there's plenty of stories of people that are sort of second and third acts. So, you know, if I can open that door for anybody my age or older to say like, "Hey, she did it," you know, I'm going to do it too, then I would be really happy.
Yes, absolutely. And you must realize, sort of having your eye on the publishing at the moment and what's being released, that you're sort of there with so many other people who've just also brought their books out in the last 12 months, like Bob Gruen, the photographer who had been in part of the 60s scene. He's got his book. And I've sort of, on this bookshelf, you know, there was another guy who just did a book called Punk, Post-Punk and New Wave, Michael Greco. You know, there's just been a lot. There's another guy who just did the Texas one. So I kind of, you know, when I saw your book suddenly appear, it's like, yes, you know, 35 years, suddenly this is all really interesting social
Right.
history, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, I definitely, and I saw that kind of happening. I saw, you know, the nostalgia that was coming from the late 70s, early 80s, that people were interested. I saw it in the publishing market. There was a book called City on Fire that, you know, had a lot about CBG. I think that was the name of it. Had a lot about CBGBs in it, and so I said to myself, I think people are really starting to be nostalgic for this time period, you know? So I'm gonna write about it, as
Yes.
best
Well,
as I
and also,
can.
I think it's about making sense of something that's happened that you have, it's almost like, without sounding corny, a bit you're processing probably quite a lot during that time as
Absolutely.
well, when you were sitting there, probably having to sort of stare out the window thinking, right, I must stop writing. But, the memories must be there, and you must kind of feel like, wow, that doesn't seem that long ago, but it is 35 years ago. So it must,
Right. And a lot of people say, nostalgia is bad, that it's sad or whatever. But, if you actually do the research on nostalgia, through a psychological point of view, it's really restorative and transformative to go back and examine the past and look at it. And it brings great feelings and it makes people happy. And so if I could do that, I wanted to do it as best as I could.
yes, absolutely. This is great. Just last question. I mean, if you could have said something to a sort of say, a 18-year-old self or 16, there's this kind of something that you thought, yeah, God, I would have liked to have said that to them, or there's something that I've really learned over the decades. I just wondered kind of what that would be.
Um, Geez, there's a lot of things that because I do work with teenagers, and when I signed the card that went in the book, I signed it, "Make it happen," because I want kids today, and even my younger self, to realize that if you do want to do something, you can make it happen if you really want to. And our scene was small. It wasn't, I wasn't Bob Brune, like taking punk rock pictures. Like I don't even want to be in the same sentence as that. but we had an enormous amount of fun, and it impacted me in a positive way in my career now. And I see that in a lot of people that were involved with punk rock, who went on to become social activists and ethical business owners, and incredibly cool people who help others. And so I would just, I just wish I did kind of even more, like I look back and I wish I wasn't, we were young, we were naive, and we were probably a little bit scared and stuff. But I'm really happy that I had the opportunity to be a part of it.
Yes, you were
Even
a
as
play.
tiny as it was a lot of fun, and it had a long lasting impact.
Well, I think just lastly, I think that's why the 80s scene was quite interesting. That there was like lots of very small little things that didn't seem anything probably to a very small community, but then it did, within it, from like in the UK, we had all these very small little record labels who had a few little bands, didn't last for many years, apart from, say, Creation Records that went on to the 90s, but that's a bit of a different story. But mostly it was people like, 53rd and Third Records, or the Pink Label, or Sarah Records. Everyone just did it because they were a fan, and went, oh, that's that. And then suddenly it's like, oh, wait a minute, actually, that's quite an archive you built. And there's, so it is fascinating, your book, and I think it does fit in with the whole narrative of what that time was all about. It's somebody putting on some club nights for 2 years, having great fun, thinking it's been great, made no money, and I just kind of need to go back to school, or I need to go and do something else. But that's my legacy. And it's like, actually, that's an amazing legacy. When you look at those posters and you look at those gigs, you went three really good bands for £2, and you think, actually, they were really good bands, and that's kind of an interesting design, because there's another book that came out. Sorry to bore you, but this one about, a lot of the posters from that period,
Sure.
and you
Hmm.
just think, and those kids just made the posters, and then you became graphic designers, and you think, oh yeah, because they had to, they did the product, or the finished article, and it got out there, and they developed a style. So it is, I think you definitely deserve to be, what was I going to, you definitely need to be in the same bookshelf as Bob.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that, but I'm certainly honored that you think so.
Well, look, this has been fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much,
Thank
and
you so much for having me.
it's brilliant. And I'll, yeah, when I sort of do the show, I'll sort of compose you a link, and you can put it there on your
Perfect.
social media platform sites and all that. But that's been fantastic, and thanks ever so much for sort of giving me the
Thank
time for
you.
this.
Thank you so much. I'm truly honored to be here. Thank you.
Okay, take
All
care.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a great day.
You too.
And that was me in conversation with Nancy Barile, talking about her book, I'm Not Holding Your Coat, my Bruises-and-All memoir of punk rock rebellion. It's out on paperback from all good bookshops and also online. Anyway, this has been David Eastaugh, the C86 Show. If you want to contact me for some nice reason, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. You'll find it. And also, these have all been archived, and you can find the shows on Spotify, iTunes, and Podbean. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.